My ex-wife attempted to run me over when she was caught cheating, and while she struggled financially, my life started to improve. This is a long and complicated story, but I will summarize it in parts to give a clearer picture of what happened. We will refer to my soon-to-be ex-wife as Y. Y and I got married in January 2020 when I was 22 years old, and she was 21. Our marriage was a secret, known only to a few close friends since we were both living on our university campus in Miami and coming from different counties where our families were. The moment we tied the knot, our relationship turned into a toxic nightmare. One of the first red flags was her secret texting with her high school ex-boyfriend, whom we will call J. Y insisted that they were just friends, but this made me uncomfortable. It didn't help that he had been her first love. I didn't want to invade her privacy by checking her phone, but she made it hard for me to trust her. She often hid her phone screen from me, and if I so much as touched it, she would explode in anger. Eventually, I managed to figure out her passcode and checked her messages, but I found nothing concrete to follow up with. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in March 2020, everyone had to return home. Y and I were caught in a tricky situation since we hadn't told our families about our marriage. We wore our wedding rings in secret, and things seemed okay until the first week of April 2020, when Y suddenly announced that she wanted a divorce. Hearing those words shattered my heart. I begged and cried, trying to understand what went wrong or how I could make things better for her. She simply said she no longer loved me and that we weren't meant to be together. For a week, I desperately tried to salvage our marriage, but Y was incredibly stubborn. By the end of that week, I reluctantly accepted that she didn't want to be with me anymore. It was painful to come to terms with the end of our relationship, and I asked her to return the wedding rings I had given her. However, she refused, claiming they were a gift and she had the right to keep them. Legally, she might have been correct, but emotionally, I felt she didn't deserve to keep them when our marriage was over. Those rings were a significant investment for me, a long-term payment plan that I had been working on for 3 years, with only 4 months of marriage to show for it. Our argument over the phone escalated, and I ended up hanging up and crying alone in my bed. My mother noticed something was wrong and comforted me, assuring me that everything would be okay. The following day, my mother and I confronted Y's mother to tell her the truth about what was happening. This led to a heated argument between our mothers while Y stayed upstairs, refusing to come down but texting me about my decision to involve our families. Eventually, both mothers agreed that I would get the rings back, but that would happen later. 2 days later, while I was at work, Y called me in tears. She told me that her mother was kicking her out because of our secret marriage. Y expressed that she still loved me and wanted to give our relationship another chance. She promised to cut ties with J and suggested we move in together as a married couple. Caught up in my feelings, I rushed out of work to meet her. We quickly started looking for apartments nearby, and I found one that was affordable due to the pandemic. We aimed to move in just 3 days later. When I shared the news with my parents, my mother was not pleased. She warned me that I was making a mistake and urged me to rethink my choices. My father felt disappointed but reminded me that this was my life and my decision. For the next few days, my friends helped me move my things, and I hardly spoke to my parents during that time. During those difficult days, communication with my parents was nearly non-existent. This silence was particularly heartbreaking, especially for my mother. Seeing her upset truly affected me. On the first day of this new chapter in my life, I had a glimmer of hope that my marriage was finally on a positive path. I felt a sense of happiness that I had not experienced since my wife had expressed her desire for a divorce. Unfortunately, this feeling of joy was short-lived. Just a few weeks after we had moved in together, we received an invitation to go out for drinks. The night was filled with laughter, but when we returned home, I found myself compelled to look through my wife's phone. What I discovered were conversations between her and an ex, whom I will refer to as E. The messages dated back to the time when she had asked for the divorce, and reading them made my heart sink. I felt my legs weaken beneath me. At that moment, my wife was passed out on the bed. In a panic, I splashed water on her face to wake her up, and when she finally opened her eyes, I found myself screaming at her. She was still tipsy and looked confused, but my anger overwhelmed me. For 2 to 3 hours I shouted at her, my heart filled with betrayal and pain. As she began to regain her senses, I demanded that she leave. In response, she started swinging at me, chasing me around the apartment. I didn't want to retaliate, as I am not a violent person. Instead, I chose to lock myself in a room to avoid further confrontation. While I was inside, I could hear her crying and pleading for my forgiveness. She was desperate, even dropping to her knees and saying she would do anything to make things right. Though the anger still hung in the air, we began to communicate, arguing less and talking more, even through the closed bedroom door. Eventually, we both calmed down. It was around 4 a.m. when we decided to go to bed, but sleep eluded me. When 7 a.m. came, she awoke with only a partial memory of the previous night. I recounted everything that had happened, and this time, she was sober enough to grasp the gravity of the situation. Again, she pleaded for me to stay, crying and expressing that she had nowhere else to go. In that moment, I felt a deep resentment towards her, as if she had taken me away from my family, my friends, and the life I knew before. As I continued to process what I had seen in the messages, I noted there was nothing that indicated they had been physical, at least from what I read. However, some messages hinted at a level of intimacy that felt like a betrayal. For instance, she referred to E in a way that suggested they should make a video together. To me, that crossed the line. During our argument, I told her that if she promised me nothing had ever happened between her and E, I would not leave, but added that I never wanted to see her speaking to him again. She insisted that nothing had taken place, but when I pressed her about another ex, J, she hesitated before saying no. Her pause made my instincts flare up, convincing me that I needed to investigate further. My gut feeling told me this was just the beginning of a much bigger turmoil that would soon turn my entire world upside down. As an update on our situation, we found ourselves in May 2020. When I inquired again about her past with J, her response, though a reluctant no, raised even more suspicion. In April 2020, when we moved in, I was working at a call center about an hour away from our new apartment, keeping a schedule from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. My wife, however, was not working because her job had closed. To help support us, I took on side gigs with Uber Eats, Postmates, and DoorDash, typically working from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. Soon after we moved in, I noticed that while I was working, she would give me the cold shoulder when I came home. She would text me cute messages, saying she loved me and was waiting for me to get back so we could cuddle. Yet when I arrived home, she barely acknowledged me, which ultimately led me to discover her communications with E. Now, in June 2020, some weeks after that explosive night, I found myself keeping my distance from her. I maintained my work routine while trying to finish my online college classes. She was still unemployed, and upon returning home, I found the apartment often in disarray unless I took the initiative to clean it. During this time, she adopted a mini golden doodle. I had brought my own dog with us, who had been her favorite, but once the doodle entered the picture, it was clear she began to give my dog the cold shoulder too. For the next few months, the atmosphere between us was tense and distant. She seemed to give me the cold shoulder, leaving our relationship in a state of limbo. Each day felt like a repeat of the last, as we tried to have conversations and go out on dates, but every time we did, we ended up in silence. I made attempts to break the ice, hoping to find a way to work things out, but she rarely expressed her feelings. Slowly, I felt my love for her begin to fade away, numbed by her treatment of me. That all changed in October 2020. After a long silence, she finally opened up to me about her feelings. She apologized for how she had treated me over the past few months, and it felt like we were both ready to leave the past behind us. At that moment, it seemed like we were united against the world. This newfound connection grew stronger when I caught COVID-19 the following month. During my illness, she took care of me in a way that a loving partner should, even catching the virus herself in the process. After I recovered, I made it a point to return the favor. From that point on, our relationship started to feel more like a marriage again. She began to engage with my interests, delving into my hobbies such as video games, anime, art, and photography. She even joined me on my late-night deliveries, where we could listen to music together and enjoy each other's company. We discovered new things about one another, went on dates, and it felt heartwarming to be with her again. The spark between us was slowly reigniting. Despite this resurgence in our relationship, I couldn't shake off a lingering grudge about her past actions. It was challenging to completely move on from the hurt. Just before Valentine's Day in 2021, I made a discovery that would change everything. In the previous months, I had occasionally looked through her phone, but I hadn't found anything alarming. This time, I decided to dig deeper and read the messages between her and her best friend. As I sifted through their conversations, my heart sank further. I stumbled upon details concerning her relationship with a man named Jay. It turned out they had slept together just days before she asked me for a divorce, which was the real reason behind her decision. Further investigation revealed that they had a conversation in October 2020, supposedly for closure, just before she decided to give our marriage another shot. Oddly enough, this discovery didn't surprise me as much as it should have. I woke her up from her nap and confronted her about what I had read, keeping my tone surprisingly calm. Her reaction was immediate. She began to cry and apologize for her past actions. Feeling overwhelmed, I stepped outside for a drive to gather my thoughts. In the following days, I distanced myself from her, avoiding any meaningful interaction. Even though we still shared a bed, there was no physical affection between us. On Valentine's Day morning, I was jolted awake by her playful nudges and questions about my plans for the day. At that point, I was utterly exhausted from work and heartbroken over our situation. When she started crying, saying she was upset because I hadn't planned anything for her, I lost my temper. I jumped out of bed and confronted her, expressing how unreasonable it was for her to expect anything from me after what I had discovered. I let out my frustrations, telling her that she didn't deserve anything from me and that our marriage felt like a complete disaster. You might wonder why I chose to stay in this relationship. At that moment in my life, I felt utterly drained, lacking the energy to pursue anything else. I was not the vibrant person I once was. I had become a shell of my former self. The creativity that once fueled my passion for art, photography, and new adventures felt like distant memories. I felt lost, pondering the point of life itself. I recognized that it was foolish to hide my feelings, but I found it easier to do so. I was deeply entangled in my marriage, believing that turning back would only lead to an uncertain future. It felt like a dead end, and I started blaming myself for relying on her for happiness. Though I hadn't forgiven her, I had become more numb to the pain, simply existing in a state that was far from fulfilling. I forgave her for what happened, but it didn't really change how I felt. I became more numb to everything. After I found out what I did, we entered another phase where we kept our distance. This was around April 2021. During that time, she went on a trip to Peru with her grandmother. Honestly, I was a bit relieved to have the place to myself for a while. I shared the news with my friends, and they started coming over to hang out with me more often while she was away. They had no idea about what I knew, and they helped me feel like my old self again. We engaged in our familiar late-night shenanigans, played games, watched movies, and spent time together. I cherished those moments of happiness, even if they were brief. At the same time, our apartment lease was set to end in May 2021. I had been discussing my options with my father, as my mother had gone to Chicago to visit family for the rest of the year. My dad proposed the idea of me and my wife staying at their house while he followed my mom to Chicago. I agreed to this plan, despite my wife not being too thrilled about it. Ultimately, I didn't need her approval since the alternative was paying an exorbitant rent for another year. As June 2021 rolled around, I moved back in with my parents while my wife was still in Peru, though she was scheduled to come home in a few weeks. Returning to my old room provided a sense of familiarity and comfort, with a layout that reminded me of my spirited youth. I enjoyed the last few weeks of living freely, but I was acutely aware that this happiness wouldn't last forever, especially with my wife due to return from her trip. The next chapter of this story is where things took a serious turn that nearly cost me my life. Fast forward to June and July 2021, my wife and I were living at my parents' house. I started a new job in sales and quickly advanced to a supervisor position within just 2 to 3 months, which paid well enough for me to afford my dream car. Despite our living situation, my marriage felt stable, with its share of ups and downs. However, I still had a lingering sense of emptiness regarding my feelings for my wife. I could not pinpoint whether I was feeling anger, sadness, or depression. It seemed like our marriage was merely existing without purpose. By the beginning of 2022, there was some effort to reconcile. We began to go out on dates again, and we started to open up to each other more. Although we were still unsure about the status of our marriage, things seemed to be moving in a better direction. Everything appeared to be going smoothly until May 2022, when my life took a shocking turn. I decided to invite some friends over to my parents' house to watch a boxing match. I mentioned the plan to my wife, explaining it would only last a few hours and that we would likely be loud due to our excitement for the fight. She agreed to it, but as the match went on, we became louder and more animated. Eventually, my wife began texting me angrily, demanding that I keep the noise down. During the fight, she would come out to grab snacks or use the bathroom, but she slammed the door in frustration each time she returned to her room. After the fight, we realized that one of my friend's cars had a dead battery, so I offered to use mine to help jumpstart it. While we were working on that, my friends and I continued to chat and joke around for another 30 minutes. In the meanwhile, my wife kept texting me, demanding that I come inside immediately. I replied that we were almost done and was just about to head in. Suddenly, my wife stormed out of the house and headed straight for her car. Concerned, I approached her, asking if everything was all right. However, she had a serious look on her face and forcefully pushed me aside as she made her way to the car. My father had installed outdoor solar lights in the front yard, and because of the way her car was positioned, the only way out was through an area with one of those lights. She revved up her engine, and before taking off, I tried to stop her from running over the light. For a brief moment, she paused, looking at me with an intense stare. Then, without warning, she slammed her foot on the gas and sped off, nearly running me over in the process. I jumped out of the way just in time, feeling a painful graze on my knee as she took off, dragging the light underneath her car and scraping along the road. Sitting on the ground in shock, I processed what had just happened. I was stunned that she had almost hit me. My friends quickly came to help me up, asking if I was okay, but I was still trying to wrap my head around the reality of the situation. When someone asked if I was okay, I was so taken aback that I couldn't respond. I just stared at them in shock. They offered their help, but I told them to go home while I headed back inside, still rattled from the whole incident. My mind raced, and I kept trying to call my wife's phone, trying to understand why she had acted the way she did. Upon entering our room, I found her phone lying on the ground, unlocked. It had been months since I had looked through it, but now I felt compelled to do so. As I scrolled through her messages and apps, I stumbled upon shocking secrets. I discovered that she had been having an affair with Jay that lasted for months, from March 2020 to October 2020. A wave of clarity washed over me, pushing me to finally take the action I should have taken a long time ago. It was around 2 a.m., and I was still shaken up by the events. I repeatedly called my sister, who lived just down the road, hoping to share what had just happened, but she didn't answer. Just then, my wife returned and attempted to enter the house, but I quickly locked the door, adding an extra lock for good measure. I felt the panic rising within me, so I snuck out through the back and hopped into my car, hyperventilating as I drove toward my sister's house. As I pulled into her driveway, I noticed my wife following me. I rushed to knock on my sister's door, and thankfully, she and her husband opened it just in time. This caused my wife to back off and leave. Once inside, I let everything spill out to my sister. I cried as I recounted what had just happened, finally admitting how my wife had cheated on me in the past. It was tough to process, but I felt ready to end the marriage. I asked my sister to come back home with me to ensure that my wife wouldn't hurt me again. When we arrived, I saw that my wife was already packing her things. I kept my distance for a few minutes, but eventually asked her to hand back the rings and keys. She seemed to have expected this, as she quickly took them from her pocket and gave them to me. After grabbing her suitcase, she took our golden doodle with her. My sister stayed for a little while longer, and then she went home. That night became one of the longest I had ever experienced. Exhausted, I finally managed to sleep around 6 a.m., but my peace was shattered an hour later when I heard knocking at my window. It was my wife, who had spent the night in her car. She pleaded with me to let our dog back inside. As much as I wanted to help, I ignored her persistent knocking for about 30 minutes. Eventually, I reached out to meet her face to face, where I laid everything bare. I told her all that I knew and expressed my decision to separate. She broke down, begging me to let us work things out, but I had grown tired of the years of emotional and physical abuse, the constant lies, the heartbreaks. As toxic as it sounds, what happened next felt like karma for everything she had put me through. It felt refreshing to finally consider my own happiness. After our separation, my wife moved back in with her mother, but it wasn't a suitable situation for long. She didn't get along with her stepfather and was too proud to stay under her mother's roof indefinitely. Eventually, she found her own place. On August 22nd, she reached out, saying that if I ever wanted to reconcile, I was always welcome to move back in with her. Meanwhile, my parents returned from a trip to Chicago about a week after our split. Most of the furniture in our bedroom belonged to her since she had insisted I get rid of my items, replacing them with hers for the sake of aesthetics. Beyond the bedroom, we had couches, tables, and kitchen appliances stored away in another room. When the day finally came for her to collect her belongings, my father and I set everything out in the driveway but chose not to help with the moving process. She arrived with her mother, stepfather, uncle, and 2 aunts, none of whom were particularly strong. Her grandma was there too, mostly observing as they struggled to manage the move. What took my father and me about 30 minutes to accomplish took her family 2 to 3 hours. While we sipped drinks and joked about how difficult they were finding the task, we could hear them talking badly about me and my family through the window. The laughter came easily, a small comfort amid the chaos of everything that had unfolded. I don't understand why my family was included in this situation, especially since there are families that gossip and complain about everyone and everything. When she moved into her new apartment, she had just started a job related to her field of study. The job paid well by the hour, but unfortunately it didn't provide enough hours for her to make ends meet. She was too proud to take on a second job, believing that it would be beneath her. As a result, she started to struggle with paying her rent, electricity, water bill, car payments, insurance, and other expenses. She reached out to me multiple times, asking for financial help, but I couldn't bring myself to assist her. I felt that her financial difficulties were not my responsibility. She tried to manipulate me, claiming that I shouldn't allow our dog, the golden doodle, to suffer along with her. I responded by suggesting she ask her boyfriend for money instead. To my surprise, I later learned that she had confided in her mother about the situation, and her mother sided with me, saying that she wouldn't give her any money either. Despite this, the rest of her family held a grudge against me for refusing to help after she cheated on me. Their opinions didn't concern me much since none of them were married themselves. Months passed while we remained legally married. We discussed a divorce and agreed to split the fees, but neither of us had the funds to proceed. During our conversations, she admitted that she still hoped we could reconcile and expressed her belief that I still loved her. It might sound foolish, but I did love her. However, I knew I couldn't continue living in this cycle of pain. Even with everything that happened, it was hard for me to hate her. She was someone who had been close to me since high school, someone who helped me through my darkest times and brought me more happiness than anyone else ever could. Yet, she still found a way to break my spirit and made me feel inadequate. We kept in touch on social media, and even though she often claimed to be struggling financially, she seemed to be out at clubs every weekend. This would lead her to reach out to me, drunk, admitting she was wrong for how she treated me. Whenever I shared posts on Instagram or Snapchat about having fun at night, she was typically the first to see them, often within a minute, and would acknowledge that I looked happier without her. While I wouldn't necessarily call myself happy, I did feel a sense of freedom since moving out. Since our separation, she had 2 car accidents within just a few months. We were no longer on the same insurance policy, but she still called me for financial help, which I refused, telling her that she was on her own now. I had her on my phone plan for a while after our split, but eventually decided to disconnect her line without notifying her. A few days later, she angrily texted me, complaining about losing her number and having to get a new phone because her old one was still locked with my carrier, and she couldn't unlock it without my assistance as the account holder. She called me names, which I found amusing. Then there was my ex-girlfriend, with whom I parted on good terms. We remained friends until I married her. My wife insisted that I cut off my friendship with my ex because she feared that my ex would try to rekindle our relationship. After my marriage ended, my ex and I began to hang out again. When my wife discovered this, she became convinced that I had divorced her to be with my ex. In truth, I had no romantic interest in my ex anymore. I saw her as a friend. After my separation, I heard from a mutual friend that my ex tried to reconnect with me, but I was not interested. She had also attempted to get back with another guy who was now in a relationship and had a child. Occasionally, my ex would reach out to me, mentioning her struggles with bills, how she was barely eating, almost facing eviction twice, and how she couldn't afford to care for our golden doodle. I suspected she was likely receiving financial help from her grandmother. We would still text occasionally to discuss court dates or to arrange times for me to return belongings from our home. During these conversations, she often expressed that she would never find another guy like me and shared her regrets about our relationship, wishing we could try again. She often expresses a deep desire for us to have a chance to try again, feeling a sense of regret about the decisions that led us to this point. Part of me finds comfort in the idea of karma serving its role, while another part feels sadness when I reflect on how we reached this moment in our lives. In March 2023, we finally went to court to file for our divorce. As we waited for our names to be called, she stepped outside to cry, leaving me sitting there, lost in thought and unsure of how to process the situation. After about 10 minutes, it was finally our turn. We walked in together and began signing the documents that would formally end our marriage. Since that day, our communication has become sparse and limited to a few texts exchanged once every week or two, mostly just to share what we still needed to say. In the months following our separation, I experienced a significant shift in my life. I was promoted to manager at work just a month after we split up, and I managed to hold on to that position until November 2022. The workload became overwhelming, leading to sleepless nights and exhaustion. Eventually, I found a better paying job that I am still at today, which has allowed me to regain some stability. Throughout my marriage, I had struggled with my weight due to overeating, which I used as a coping mechanism for my depression. Now I am working on getting back into the gym, although I still need to establish a consistent routine. Looking ahead, I have exciting plans for the summer with my friends as well as personal goals for later in the year. It's June 2023 now, and while I wouldn't describe my life as perfect, I've learned to find solace in the fact that every time I face a tough day, I remind myself of the wisdom that comes with life's challenges. Whenever I reflect on how my life has transformed since our split, it gives me a sense of satisfaction that she may be experiencing the same struggles I faced for over 6 years. I recognize that it isn't fair to wish hardship upon her, but at the same time, I take comfort in the fact that my own life is finally moving in a positive direction. I hope that she can see how happy I am without her. As for my last update, I want to clarify a few things. I had to cut part of my previous post to keep it concise. If there are any questions, I will do my best to answer them. Our history dates back to high school, and there are many details about our relationship, how we met, and the journey that led us to marriage. In hindsight, it's clear that we had a toxic relationship, though that doesn't mean there weren't good times too. I can explain more about our relationship and marriage in future posts if needed. I appreciate all the feedback I've received, whether positive or negative. I acknowledge that I was naive in thinking everything would magically resolve itself. I'm unsure if I can view this outcome as a victory, but I do see it as a fresh start. To those who might doubt the authenticity of my story, please understand I don't have the time or energy to create a fictional narrative. I share my experience to unburden myself. Expressing my feelings has always been a challenge for me, and while Reddit isn't the ideal platform for this, finding a community of people with similar experiences has made it easier. I appreciate everyone for taking the time to read my lengthy updates. Unfortunately, this isn't my first experience with hurt. I've gone through another relationship that changed me and shaped who I am today. It may sound dramatic, but that's the reality of my journey. I am open to discussing that past relationship at some point. Today, I am heading to court to meet with my wife, who I've referred to as Y. She texted me on Monday, June 26th, reminding me of our court date on June 30th. Just yesterday, she sent another reminder and requested a few items that I still have of hers. I also asked for some things in return. We still follow each other on social media, so I occasionally see her posts, although I don't look for them intentionally. I notice that she seems to be moving on, possibly dating someone new, as she has been sharing messages with another guy. I don't believe she's doing this to provoke jealousy, but rather because she enjoys the attention, which was a pattern during our relationship too. Surprisingly, I feel no jealousy or bitterness toward her. Rather, I feel relief knowing she is moving forward. Someone else is now taking on the challenges I faced with her, and I wish them well because they will need it. As for the court appearance, I am actually feeling excited about it. It's another step in my journey to fully move on. I am ready to move on with my life, and she can finally step aside. She mentioned that even after the divorce is finalized, we could still be friends, mainly because of our golden doodle that we share. While I do love that dog, I realize that I need to let everything else go. Once we wrap up the final steps of this process, I plan to block her on all social media and other platforms, ensuring that I won't have to see or hear anything about her again. As for my own situation, I haven't made any effort to meet anyone new. I find myself lacking the motivation to try again. The biggest hurdle I face is my trust issues and my own insecurities. In previous relationships, it has always been the woman who made the first move toward me. I understand that I should change this pattern, but for now, my primary focus is on my work and the bills I am close to paying off. One of my friends has been training me at the gym, and I am proud to say that I have already lost 10 pounds. Next week, my friends and I are going on a summer trip, and we have several exciting locations planned to visit within our state. Life has been good for me recently, and I will make sure to update you on how the court proceedings go once everything is settled. In my last update, I apologize for the delay. I have been working a lot of overtime, but I finally found some time to share what happened. On Friday, June 30th, we headed to the courthouse and waited for our turn to meet with the clerk. After just a few minutes, we were called up, but there was only one chair available. I took the chair for myself, and even though I wasn't looking at her, I could feel her intense gaze on me. She asked if she could at least sit down, and I told her to go ahead and grab a chair. She responded with a dismissive, "Whatever," and chose to stand. We explained our reasons for the divorce, and there was no fighting or bickering. We were simply ready to separate. Several times during the process, the clerk had to walk back and forth or type things into the computer. During those moments, my ex-wife made little comments, saying things like she couldn't wait to be free of me, and that I had trapped her into our marriage. She claimed that I had never satisfied her, and while it might sound bad, I understood that most of those remarks were a cover for her real feelings. I noted that she even mentioned I should have fun with my ex, with whom I am still friends, but as I stated before, I am not interested in rekindling anything. Throughout our back-and-forth exchanges, the clerk was clearly trying hard not to laugh at the situation. After paying the necessary fees, we learned that we just had one more court date left in 1 to 2 months. As we walked out, it was raining, and we continued to discuss a few things. The main topic was her asking if I could take care of our golden doodle in August while she goes on a trip out of the country. I told her that wouldn't be possible, and she called me a deadbeat dog dad, claiming I would never see the dog again before she stormed off. Here's the twist: just yesterday, she asked me if I could take care of the golden doodle today, but I can't because I have to work, even though it's the 4th of July. Additionally, today is her birthday, but she won't be getting any birthday wishes from me. Her family does not celebrate birthdays, especially her mother and stepfather, who are Jehovah's Witnesses. So, her only option for celebrating is her best friend, who is likely busy with her boyfriend rather than spending time with her. Currently, I am at work, just 2 days away from my vacation. There hasn't been much change since my last update, but I am hopeful for what lies ahead.